and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. Some 10 months ago, we sponsored a program on the future of Ukraine in the form of a debate with two very distinguished foreign policy experts who hold markedly different perspectives on Ukraine, on the cause of the war, the conduct of the war, and its likely outcome. A lot has happened in the last 10 months in Ukraine and Russia, so I'm delighted that these two gentlemen agreed to return to do another program on this subject. As that show we taped more than 10 months ago was very lively, I have every expectation that our program today will be quite lively as well. One of our guests is Herman Pirchner. He is the president of the American Foreign Policy Council, which was founded back in 1982 in Washington to provide some well-thought-out perspectives on foreign policy questions. In 1982, Herman was the president of American Foreign Policy Council, and today, more than 40 years later, he remains as the president of this important and distinguished group. Now, Herman has held other significant positions as well, senior Senate staff, and as director of the National Security Team, advising former presidential candidate and former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. The AFPC, American Foreign Policy Council, also publishes a great deal of material from its senior fellows and senior management in the form of monographs and books or shorter papers for briefing. Herman has hosted hundreds of delegations from foreign countries to come to the United States to meet senior American political leaders. And likewise, he has sent these senior American political leaders to foreign countries to meet with their peers. He did this for quite a few years in China and likewise in Russia, and has done it for the last 10 years in Ukraine, a country with which he is very familiar and to which he has traveled often. Herman has also written a good deal, and there are two of his books I would like to mention that particularly pertain to the topic we're covering today. One was a work in 2004, which shows the kind of prescience that Herman exercises or possesses, Reviving Greater Russia, the future of Russia's borders with Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Moldova, and Ukraine. He is also the author of Post-Putin, Succession, Stability, and Russia's Future, which is also available in Russian and Ukrainian. Our second guest is Stephen Bryen. He has also held senior Senate staff positions, including for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he has excelled in both the private sector and the government sector. For many years, he was one of the senior civilian employees at the Department of Defense, a position in which he gained the highest award given by the Department of Defense to civilians, not once, but twice. I'm speaking of the Distinguished Service Medal. Now, Dr. Bryen is particularly expert on technology and strategy, and as such has been contributing to other Westminster shows on China, Japan, Taiwan, as well as on Russia and Ukraine. I should also mention that he was the executive director of a grassroots political organization, the head of the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and in the Pentagon he served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Trade Security Policy. Dr. Bryen is also a frequent contributor on foreign policy matters in his own column, which appears usually a couple of times weekly, in which he gives his sometimes unique perspective on the burning questions of the day, including Russia and Ukraine. So we're delighted he is also back here with us to further debate future of Ukraine. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, there have been some very interesting changes. Of course, the Kursk invasion by Ukraine is one of the ones that's highlighted by many people and, of course, a lot of journalists. But other things have happened, including very significantly the steady advance of Russian forces on the eastern border of Ukraine and getting them further along to their dream of taking all of Donbass and Luhansk. So let's start, Herman Pirchner, with you, since I neglected to mention how many times you've been to Ukraine, and before that, of course, you were in Russia very frequently, and you've brought Ukrainian delegations to the United States. You were there recently, and I know you're very well informed on the situation. Let's have your perspective on this issue and ask you if you've been able to maintain any optimism in terms of a favorable outcome for Ukraine.
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be back with you, and I look forward to hearing Steve's views and how they may or may not have evolved given circumstances. The central strategic question to my mind is this. If Russia is permitted to use nuclear blackmail, to use the repeated use of war crimes to take land from a peaceful country, then it's only a matter of time before that lesson is repeated, not just by Russia when they gain strength enough to attack again, but also by China, Iran, and others. I mean, it's no big secret why South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan favor a Russian defeat, because if Russia is seen to succeed with this nuclear blackmail and other tactics, it strengthens the hawks in Beijing, and you can say the same about Tehran. Russia has a history of imperialism that dates back a long time. Between 1450 and 1900, Russia gained an average of 50 square miles per day added it to its territory. That figure was computed by Orlando Figes Figes, and you can see a detailed description of that. And they did it by attacking when they were strong, resting, and attacking again. So we see this repeated somehow in the current era with 2008 into Georgia, 2014 in Ukraine, 2022 in Ukraine. And if you want to go back a little bit, you can talk about the repeated invasions of Poland, 1772, 1793, 1795, 1920, 1938, and so forth. So when you talk about helping Ukraine, you're also talking about helping others that may be threatened. It's not an accident that Sweden and Finland have chosen to join NATO because they had to take Russian claims on their territory seriously. It's not an accident that the Baltic states and Poland wanted to be part of NATO because they had no way to defend themselves without help. And those claims go further. Russia has great claims for instance against Denmark. I think something like 80,000 square miles of Arctic Ocean. But of course, having ambitions and being able to carry them out are very different things. And we're seeing this in Ukraine to come to the current times. When Russia first invaded in 22, everybody thought 3 days they'd take Kiev. They did not. Then there was the ambition to take maybe just Novorossiya, which is the southern part of Russia, maybe going to Odessa, maybe connecting with Transnistria and Moldova. That did not work. And then there's the ambition to take all of Donbass and Luhansk. That hasn't happened. Now, the most recent pronouncement by Putin is that by October 1, they'll be able to take a city in Donbass of about 30,000 people per pre-war population. In fact, in the last day or two, things have bogged down for Russia on the Eastern Front, and I see no gains in the last 24 hours by Russia along that front, and a number of attacks down dramatically. In fact, since January 1, the total number of square kilometers taken by Ukraine, primarily in Donbass, though not entirely, because Ukraine's made modest gains on the Eastern Front, but they've taken roughly the same amount of territory that Russia has taken from Ukraine during that period. In other words, there's a net close to zero in terms of total land conquered. Now, does this suggest stalemate? I think stalemate may be too broad a term. I would say it suggests a military stalemate, but a military stalemate does not mean a defeat for Ukraine or a victory for Russia. Remember that the U.S. wasn't known for losing battles in Vietnam, but we lost the war. We pulled out for domestic reasons, for the same reason China did several times, for the same reason the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan. And I think the evidence of problems building up inside of Russia, evidence that the elite in Russia are starting to see that the interests of Russia are not the same interests of Putin, have to give rise to the possibility that Putin may not survive and that Russia may finally have to withdraw. Now, that's certainly not a given. We don't know how the military question will play out, but I think it's important to think about the weaknesses that Russia has exhibited, and that's not discussed so much. For instance, you have, remember a year ago when Prigozhin, the commander of Wagner, took a march on Moscow. No military units rose to stop his march. They sat on their tufts. And he did this not criticizing Putin. But in the last weeks, the commander of Paladin, another mercenary force of Russia that operates in Congo and other places in the world, has issued a stinging denunciation of Putin, talking about all the failures of the war and blaming it on the great Russian leader Putin. Now, why does a man that has great connections to the Russian army, has great connections to Russian intelligence services, and knowing the example of Prigozhin, suddenly choose this moment to publicly denounce Putin? And on Telegraph and other things, this has been broadcast over Russia. And it's probably because he's sensing some support for this position within the military, some support for this position within the intelligence services. Maybe he's looking at the damage being done to the Russian economy. We know 3-4 days ago, Russia stopped publishing figures of export of petroleum products because their production is down, and that's dangerous. It may be because he's looking at reports on the study of social media inside of Russia to indicate growing opposition to the war. Anyway, there are many other reasons that Russia is having internal problems, including the inability to produce certain weapons, or being known as a 440 country because of their primitive nature. Bottom line, it's not a given that if we support Ukraine with arms, they win, but it's the best course of action, and they have a path to victory.
Thank you, Herman. Steve?
Well, we have a different perspective than Herman's, and different news services, I think, too.
Yeah.
My assessment is quite radically different from Herman's. I think Ukraine is losing the war. Let's start there. I think its army is getting beat up very badly, especially in southern Donetsk right now. The Russians are adding square kilometers every day to their takings in that area. Pokrovsk, which is the emerging big battle, has not concluded yet by any means, but it's certainly being surrounded by the Russians, and I think that's their next target. So operationally, I think they're doing very well. Kursk is a separate matter. I think it's a foolish move by the Ukrainian, by Zelensky, actually, because I think it's what he's promoting it. Because it has drawn off some of their better forces from being able to defend key areas. in Donetsk, which is more strategically important. So most of the evidence, and it's not all conclusive by any means, and we lack a lot of information, but most of the evidence shows that the Ukrainian military is starting to be ground down. I think they've been tenacious. They've fought very hard, for sure. But there's simply a limit to how long they can go on. And, it's very hard to tell where the breaking point is. I think I understand the short-term Russian strategy. I don't pretend to understand the long-term, but the short-term is to try and create a cauldron. They call it a cauldron or a pincer around the main units of the Ukrainian army and trap them. And that's why places like Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar and other locations, which aren't over with by any means yet, but which are indicative, I think, of what the Russian strategy militarily is. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate to what their strategic objectives are in Ukraine. And that's I think Herman is quite right that's a major issue. And I don't think there's good answers to that because we don't know yet. If I were betting, and I don't like to bet because I usually lose, but if I were betting, I think that what the Russians are going to want is a change of Ukrainian government for sure that's more favorable to Russia, and the removal of NATO forces and NATO influence in Ukraine. I think that's their key objective. And I think it has been all along. We can go back and review the whole history of the war. I think it was a very unprepared Russian military that invaded. They didn't expect to actually have to do it. I think they were caught by surprise. They weren't prepared, and they were under very bad leadership. But a lot of that has changed over time as they reshuffled their leadership. They have improved their tactics and their operations. And now that's showing very vividly in the actual conduct of the war. The bigger question, I suppose, are two. One is what will happen with Ukraine and how soon will it happen? And there are different estimates on that. I don't think it's going to last too much longer, frankly, because I don't think the Ukrainians can sustain it too much longer in terms of casualties, in terms of their fighting ability, and a morale, which is starting to crack in some places. And what follows from that's the other question, the bigger one, which is how does that impact Europe? How does it impact NATO? How does it impact American strategy? I mean, one of the features of this war that isn't often talked about enough is that we have plowed in an awful lot of equipment into the Ukraine war, mainly, in fact, almost exclusively tactical military equipment, leaving ourselves with some big absences in terms of inventory of weapons and capabilities that we might need in the Pacific and other places, and the Middle East for that matter. So that arms sales for Taiwan have been held up. Arms sales for Israel have been held up, not only because of politics, some of it was politics in the case of Israel, but some of it was just they didn't have it. They don't have the supplies. 155 millimeter ammo is a great example. Just don't have any. And what we had, we shipped to Ukraine. So that leaves our forces in a kind of quandary if another war would break out elsewhere. And of course, I worry about China a great deal because I think they're a growing threat in the Pacific. And from a strategic point of view, it's far more important than Ukraine, in my estimate. I think Ukraine was a mistake from the get-go. We should have found some way to work a deal when we could have. But that's water over the dam, of course. Whether we could have or couldn't have is academic now. The Ukrainians didn't want to. Washington didn't want to. NATO didn't want to. The Russians didn't want to. Nobody wanted to. And so you end up in a war. I'm not sure about Herman's terminology, nuclear blackmail. Russia is certainly a nuclear power, but so is China. And pretty soon Iran will be. So I know, is that nuclear blackmail? I think that we so far, thank God, it's been a conventional fight. with largely conventional weapons on both sides. And there have been some very interesting developments of how new types of weapons like drones are playing an increasingly important role in combat, which we are now learning. And I think we'll learn a lot. But the Russians are also learning a lot because we're pushing some of our best weapons. HIMARS is just one example. ATACMS is another example into the fight, and they're learning how to counter them. So it's also in helping them understand how to deal with us. There's no doubt, and I want to make it very clear, and I think Herman and I would agree on this. There's no doubt there's a really significant competition between Russia on the one side and its block of not very savory bunch of characters and the Western world. That fight is absolutely on. The question of Ukraine is not about, in my opinion, is yes, you can try to hold Ukraine, but you're going to pay a high cost. You're going to deplete your arsenals, and you may lose. That's my opinion. So stop there, and we can go on from there.
Let me ask you both about the significance of the cabinet changes in both Ukraine and Russia. Zelensky has made a pretty clean sweep. Putin seems to be more selective in the changes he's made in the cabinet. One of the most interesting of which is to remove a military figure as Minister of Defense and install an accountant.
Well, he's not. Yeah, you're talking. He's not really a military figure. He wears a military uniform, but he's not a combat. He's not a combat guy. So I mean that. But I think the problem in Russia, which is an endemic problem in Russia across the board, is corruption. And the problem in the military was delivering goods to the soldiers, even down to simple things like rations that were substandard, poor, where they were charging high fees. It's a racket. Putin didn't like it. Not that he has much room to talk about it, but he didn't like it. The troops didn't like it. Some of the commanders hated it. And so they're cleaning house. They've made a number of arrests of senior military figures who have, none of them gone to jail yet, but they've been arrested. And it's all about corruption. So that's Herman can talk about the Ukrainian side, but that's what I know about the Russian side.
Well, there's so much corruption in Russia. If you want to charge somebody in corruption, just figure out who your enemy is and go after him. Everybody's guilty. And you have the same thing in China and other places. One point I want to respond to is, when I was in Ukraine in January, you hear the same story over and over again. Many more of us going to die, but we don't want to surrender the lives of our children and grandchildren to Moscow rule. If you're looking at the polling, more than 70% of the Ukrainian population is not willing to give up land for peace. They're going to continue to fight. And there's a lot of comment about the manpower, but they had an electric sign up for draft and over 2 million Ukrainians signed up. The problem is at least as much in terms of training capability and equipment.
Where are those 2 million people, Herman? They don't have 2 million people signed up.
Pardon?
Where'd you get that number?
It's a public figure.
No, it's not. There's no such thing.
Happy to.
They have not recruited 2 million people into the army. Not yesterday.
No. They signed up to register. They're not into the army. They
Oh,
signed up to be,
all right.
No, they'd be called up. No, they're not in the army.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So I think you're going to have Ukraine continuing to fight, and I don't think the will to fight is going to stay there with Russia, which is why I'm more optimistic than Steve is about the outcome of the war. Now, the changing of personnel, in part, I think, is burnout. I think it's in part consolidation of power by Zelensky, who has internal politics to worry about. Do I think it'll affect the outcome of the war? I think not too much.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think it has any impact at all. I think, but the Zelensky is not the first shakeup he's done. It's like the third.
Yeah.
Yeah, he does it all the time. But it seems the biggest one is Kaluba, who's the foreign minister, who's apparently was fired, but the Verkhovna Rada, the legislature there, has not approved his firing. So there may be a political struggle here that we're not so aware of.
So Zelensky has named his deputy as foreign minister, and I agree with Steve. It's not clear how that'll play out.
Yeah.
But as has been done with other people, there'll be another job for him in the administration. So.
Are you at all surprised that these significant changes have been made, including in Russia, in the middle of a war at a particularly intense time? That's usually not looked upon as a good time to make changes of this importance.
Well, that's not exactly right, because we changed commanders in wartime in many wars. We certainly did it in World War II.
Our Civil War?
Civil War, for sure. I mean, it happens. You generally weed out the bad eggs and go with the ones that are effective. In Russia, I think what's happened is that they want to jack up their whole military industrial complex, let's call it that. It's Eisenhower's famous terminology. And they want higher production of weapons and new weapons. And there was a great concern that they weren't getting there because of the corruption and the lack of modern, what can we call it, management. And that's why you put a new defense minister in, who that's his specialty. He's not a defense guy. He's an industrial, the economic guy. So
there's also a struggle going on between the intelligence services and the military, which is why you have a disproportionate intelligence presence in Kursk as opposed to clear military command there. So internal battles inside of Russia.
I don't know if it's a battle or whether that's how they do things.
When have those two organizations gotten along ever?
Well, in any country.
Yeah.
Try it out. Try out any others you like. It goes on. I mean, I don't think that's very significant. I think the significant question for the Russians right now is how much force they want to bring to bear in this war. It seems to me, they've been fairly consistent in not jacking up the number of troops too high. They have a huge reserve. And they're following a steady program. You don't have to agree with it, but there's a steady program of trying to take more of the Donbass and to trap the Ukrainian army, which is what their goal.
Well, they have, but they simply have not taken very much territory since January 1 of this year. It's roughly equal to the number of square kilometers Ukraine has taken in Kursk.
Yeah, but there's nothing up there.
And on a 650-mile front,
not even
how many spaces have Russians taken more than a couple kilometers? Not many. There are only a couple places.
Tens of kilometers and in critical towns. I mean, come on. Let's be honest.
10 kilometers is 6 miles. And with the number of losses, the Brits think the Russians have been losing more than 1,000 a day over a period of months. So,
who's losing 1,000 a day? That's a British number?
British number, yeah.
Yeah, I don't believe it. I don't know what it is, by the way. And
well, I don't know what it is either, but it's a lot.
There are no reliable numbers in this war from either side, and I wouldn't believe a single one of them because they're all fake. I mean, the question is, are the Ukrainians able to hold these strongholds, which they built? Consider Pokrovsk, which is a stronghold town. I mean, it's highly fortified. And can they, like Avdiivka was, like Bakhmut was, and can they hold it? Well, those two they didn't hold, and it looks like they're going to lose Pokrovsk over time. How soon?
Well, it's possible. There have been no gains in the last 3 days, and the defenses on the edge of the town are substantial. We'll see. I agree. I don't know how it'll turn out.
In other villages, but I think the important thing here is that the Ukrainians are on their backs in these places, and they're having serious difficulty. And they're saying so. They're open about that. They're not lying.
Is it more significant than territory lost in Kursk?
Kursk is nothing. I mean, it's an empty area. It's mostly small.
It's the big shockwave inside of Moscow and destabilizing to the Putin regime.
It's not destabilizing anything. Where do you see that?
We'll see.
There's no evidence of any destabilization. I think they're annoyed. I think the Chinese, they're pissed off that they weren't prepared for that move, and they got caught with their pants down. No doubt about that. Otherwise, they would have had it fortified, and they would have blocked it right away. But it's not strategic territory because it doesn't mean anything. You can't go anywhere from there.
It has to do with internal Russian politics.
And I don't think it does. I mean, that's where we would differ, because I don't see any evidence that there's any fall off in Putin's leadership there at all. I know there's a wishful thinking on the Western part that somehow we can overturn the Putin, get rid of Putin, and everything will be okay.
Well, we can't get rid of Putin, but
We're not going to get rid of Putin.
the Russians still can. And after all, this is how people go out. We did a study of 120 post-World War II dictatorships of 10 million people or more. What happens to them? 42% by coups, 20% by assassination.
It's bad business. You don't want to be a dictator. There are some exceptions to the rule.
Castro made it to the end, and some others.
Franco. I mean, you can go down the list. You can find examples of both.
Yeah, but think about the big case against Putin. If he says, I'm scared of NATO, is NATO bigger now or smaller? Is it more unified or less unified? Is it better funded or less funded? What about the strategic advantage in oil and petroleum sales in Europe? That's gone. What about the political influence that comes from that? Is that gone? What about the intellectual flight of the best and brightest young technical people? They've left Russia not to come back. What about the degradation of the Russian army that may even have trouble with, at some point, with civil wars in the Northern Caucasus, the Chechens and so forth? You can go on and on about Putin's misjudgments, and I think it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand that some people are not happy and ambitious people are looking for opportunities. The man is not all powerful, and going back to Grigory Zakharevsky's condemnation of Putin, there's a reason for that. It's a serious guy making condemnations, and others are doing too. Look at former Kremlin chief of staff Yevgeny Sebastianov saying no Russian leader is affected, has caused more damage to Russian interest in Putin. Those denunciations.
Well, I don't have any brief for Putin. All I'm saying is, if you base American policy on the myth that somehow Russia's going to turn over its leadership, you're making a big mistake. It's a bad strategy. If it happens, great, but it's not going to happen, in my opinion, anytime soon. But if it happens, it happens. Well, but to try and base your national strategy on something as chimerical as that seems to me foolish. I think what you want to do.
I don't think you base your strategy on it, but I think you monitor it. And certainly you base your strategy on not letting Russian aggression using war crimes and nuclear blackmail, which they do.
That's where you started. But I don't necessarily disagree with any of that. That's not my point. You're not listening to me.
Yeah.
Listen to what I'm saying. If you base your national strategy that somehow Russia is going to turn over its leadership and become peaceful and happy, you're dreaming.
No, okay. They won't. I mean, I wrote a whole book about this in 2019.
You might get a nationalist leader that's 10 times worse than Putin, with rattling his nuclear weapons, or using those goddamn things. So I think this is a crazy kind of thinking that's going on in the West right now. It's not. It's all over the place. That somehow, that we'll just have to hang on until Putin disappears.
Well, at some point.
Well, he will eventually.
At some point, the Soviets quit Afghanistan. At some point, the United States kept Vietnam. And what's the alternative? The alternative is to let Putin grab territory, rest, and then grab more territory and more territory. You can't permit that model of success. The Russians killed my good friend
Adolf Dobbs in Afghanistan. Never forgot it. He was a very good friend. I didn't like what they did there. It was horrible. They're good at horrible. Okay.
Yeah.
That's not what you base your policy on. Chinese are good at horrible too. I mean, you don't base your policy on that. You base your policy on how to deal with the threat in a practical way. And if you squander all your resources in this adventure in Ukraine such that you weaken our defenses elsewhere and you risk even Europe, it's a crazy way to go about it. That's my opinion. Now, not everybody shares it. I know that.
The countries most threatened by China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan are rooting for Russia to be defeated.
They're rooting for the
They
United
not know
States.
their own
They're rooting
interests?
for the United States, actually,
I'm sorry.
because they depend on the United States for their security. Japan is a small, tiny army. It's not able to fight at all.
No.
Taiwan is a poor island with 28 million people against 1 billion Chinese. You know, the numbers are very demonstrative. These are countries that are hoping that we'll make the difference for their survival. So if we risk that because we don't have HIMARS, we gave them all to Ukraine, or we don't want to have 155 millimeter ammo, or we don't have TOW missiles, or you name it, go on down the list, javelins, then they're left naked and alone. So no one has considered that carefully because we haven't been able to, you know, what we've discovered in this country is that trying to strengthen our defense industry and get more productivity hasn't really worked out. Hasn't really
wargaming I'm familiar with, and maybe
takes too long to produce these weapons in any quantity, and then we give them to Ukraine anyway. So you know, you have to kind of balance things here somehow, or we're going to get taken to the cleaners. That's my
Gentlemen, if I can.
I'm familiar with says we run out of weapons in a fight with China over Taiwan within a couple of weeks. So we have the shortage, and that's an enormous problem. But there are weapons that we're certain numbers of ATACMS that we're decommissioning that could go to Ukraine without any difficulty if there was will.
Well, if I could just direct a discussion to this area, both Putin and Zelensky have both talked about negotiations. Of course, they have different terms for those negotiations to begin, etc. But the very fact that they're talking about negotiations may be significant or not. I would like your opinion on that. And also, do you think the war there has reached the point where what they're doing now is jockeying for a better position, to be in a better position at the beginning of those negotiations? Zelensky has said outright that the Kursk incursion is to have a chit in those negotiations that he wouldn't have unless they had successfully undertaken that invasion. And of course, we know that, as Steve Bryen has mentioned, Russia is able to keep up the pressure over a several hundred-mile front, which Ukraine cannot possibly meet in all those locations because of the size of its military and the fact that they have sent a significant part of it into Kursk. So are we at that kind of tipping point that they're saying, okay, both sides, we need to wrap this up, because otherwise there doesn't seem to be any conclusion in the near future that's going to end up any different way than it would now if we began peace negotiations? Steve, do you want to take a shot at that?
I'll take a stab at it, but it's Modi was just in Kiev a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I'm not sure which it was, trying to promote some kind of peace initiative, and didn't get anywhere. Zero.
I think that's just right. It's politically not possible for any Ukrainian government to trade land for peace at this point.
Well, then there's no negotiation, right?
That's right.
So there will be no negotiation. And I think the Russians now feel the same way.
Yeah.
So, right now, there's zero prospects.
Well, Herman, let me ask you, at a certain point, after taking a terrible beating, from what I've been reading, there are more and more Ukrainians who are facing the political reality of their military situation, and more of them understand it's not a matter of our surrendering Ukrainian territory. The Russians have already captured that territory, and we have no prospects of pushing them out of Donbass and Luhansk, much less Crimea. So reality intrudes in wars at a point at which people realize, unless they want even bigger losses, they're going to have to come up with something.
The fundamental political reality in Ukraine is that repeated foreign polls show 70-some% of the Ukrainian population does not want to trade land for peace. Are they in favor of negotiations? Are they in favor of peace? Yes. Do they want to give up land for it? No.
Well, how are they going to get the land back? I mean, it doesn't matter how they feel, it's what they can do.
I'll tell you what they think, it may be right or wrong. They think if they continue to get enough arms to fight, they'll outlast Russia and time is on their side.
Actually, I think they think differently. I think the game is to try and get NATO to intervene. And that the reason they want to do deep strikes with missiles in Russia, which won't change the war, is designed to get the Russians mad enough to do something stupid and draw in NATO and create a Europe-wide war, because they think that's the only way they're going to be saved. That's what I think the game is. I don't like that game. I don't think it's a good game. I don't think NATO will go to war in Ukraine. At least I hope not. But because it won't be just in Ukraine, it'll be in Europe. So if we want World War III, that's one way to get there.
I would say, Steve, that Putin seems to be well aware of the danger of a war with NATO and has not expressed any willingness to push in that direction.
Oh, no, he's pushed the other way around.
Right.
I mean, he keeps saying we don't have any fight with Europe. Of course, the Europeans have a different view, but that's Putin. But I think the problem is we're in a black period now, because there's no negotiation. There's no chance of any, at least that's how it looks now. And the war is continuing, and the Russians, as I said before, I believe are gaining.
Well, it doesn't seem under any circumstances that Russia would give up. They have the resources to continue. They have the manpower to continue. And those are two things that are very much in doubt in Ukraine, because they're getting their resources from Western countries.
And Western countries have less and less to give.
They have less to give and at a greater cost to themselves.
Trying, but I think that, the amount of equipment that's been handed over and the amount that's been lost is just pretty staggering.
Well,
You have
there's
mentioned
a lot of equipment loss on the Russian side that can't be.
Yeah, but they have more.
No, they don't have more.
I don't agree. They have a lot.
They're running out of artillery. So, but Steve was correct that you can't count on a change of government in Russia. But on the other hand, you can't count on no change either. You have to be ready for any option.
Yeah, I just think my point was not that you can't. My point was that if you can't put your policy based on that, your interests are your interests. If the Russian government changes, maybe it's for the good, and maybe it's even worse. I mean, you just can't bet on that. What you do is you want to say, is my strategy, is my national strategy, the right one to protect American interests? Talking about American interests.
Yeah.
Right? We want to protect America's interests. We want to make sure America remains strong. We want to make sure we can deal with threats elsewhere in the world, especially China. These are critical issues. And you keep funneling stuff to Ukraine with not even a single look at where you stand in terms of your capabilities, and what remains is crazy. And I think
I think all your goals are
reckless.
I think all your goals are correct, but I think your answer is wrong. I think we protect all those goals by helping Ukraine defeat Russia.
Good luck.
Well, we'll find out. We'll find out with time.
Speaking of NATO, gentlemen, and Europe, has their view of a Russian threat increased or diminished according to the status of the war now? As you know, after the Russian invasion, NATO and other European powers were sufficiently alarmed that there were 3 new NATO members, And even Germany was talking about increasing its defense budget to meet the.
But their chancellor told them no, because they have no money.
Yeah.
Well, that's the problem. Yeah. Have any of them met those obligations? Has their sense of alarm diminished to the point where they have now said, well, we can't afford this military buildup. Our countries are tipping into recession, and therefore we're not going to undertake it. We'll just rely on the United States to come to our rescue, as has been the case over recent decades when they.
A lot of that's true. I mean, it's a welfare operation. And some of them have built up a bit. Poles, I think, have done a good job in that respect. The Germans have not. The British are in terrible trouble economically, and their military is shrinking. They can't afford to keep what they've got, which is the size of the British Army now is smaller than it was at the time of the American Revolution. It's really pretty bad. The French have a modestly sized military, but it's mostly territorial, very little projection capability. The bottom line is that without the United States, NATO is pretty much finished. So it has to absolutely rely on the United States. That's the reality. I think every analyst would agree with that. Just count noses. I mean, there are 970 million, roughly 970 million, I may be off a few million people in Europe that are members of NATO. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of economic power, but it doesn't show up in their military and strategic planning at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just isn't there. I mean, what Trump complained about 2% is just child's play compared to the bigger problem, which is the lack of a real defense capability in Western Europe, well, in Eastern and Western Europe, for that matter, with the exception of Poland, which I think has done some improvement.
Yeah. Well, I think you find a direct correlation between countries like Poland and the Baltics. The closer you are to Russia, the more likely you are to raise your defense budget because you feel the threat more acutely.
Unless you're Hungary, and then you don't at all.
Well, that's a case all by itself. But I think you'll find something interesting about the German defense companies are beginning to make plans and actually beginning to build defense manufacturing in Western Ukraine now. They can do it quicker because they don't have the environmental restrictions on building, and they have a workforce.
So give nice targets for the Russians.
In Western Ukraine, you really think?
Well, they're already hitting Lviv quite regularly now. Lviv is pretty west. It's almost
well, it's absolutely west, but it's can you not protect factories? Maybe.
Well, you couldn't protect the 179th Training Center in Ukraine, which the Russians just hit with Iskander missiles. I mean, it's very difficult, Herman. I mean,
yeah, but we also don't give them their defense they're asking.
Target painted on it.
We don't give them their defense they're asking for.
If I were the Germans, I would get paid up front for those factories.
Yeah, they're investing their own money, as are the Turks.
And they're nuts because they're going to lose their shirts.
Well, obviously they have a different point of view, or they wouldn't invest.
I mean, if you want to bet your bet. But it seems to me, why don't they invest in German manufacturing? Where is it? Because the German government won't buy it.
Well, gentlemen, overall, would you say after what we're 2.5 years into this war, are the Europeans as worried about Russia, less worried because they've seen perhaps some diminished capabilities and the limits of Russian military power?
They're more worried. I think I agree with Herman on that. They're more because
they're worried, and they're also worried about what might happen in the United States. So
they're going to join Putin in voting for Harris. Well, he endorsed her today, so.
I can't top that one.
They're taking a close look at their economies, that is in Ukraine and Russia, with the expectation that this war is not going to be over tomorrow. And One thing that certainly has gotten Putin's attention is the fall in the ruble and the state of inflation in that country, which you would think would have to impact on the war effort if, at a certain point, if that gets serious enough. And of course, Ukraine has its own economic problems since it's surviving on the largest of other nations.
Yeah, and it can't pay its debt.
Yeah. Russia is notoriously off when they issue any projections on economics. And they're projecting only a 1% growth next year. It probably means they really believe in negative growth. So the constraints on Russian economic capability are likely to continue, especially if more oil production facilities and terminals are taken out.
We'll see about that. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an economist. I'm not going to bet on the Russian economy in any case because it's not a very good bet.
We've talked about the European policy. What?
By the way, the Europeans are not in such great shape either when it comes to economics.
Right. And we may not be soon enough.
We are not. I mean, look at the debt.
Yes, the staggering debt and tipping into recession. But what do you think today should be the U.S. policy toward this conflict? Herman?
We should give the Ukrainians what they're asking for and not have restrictions on attack and use inside of Russia.
And you don't see any danger of flipping this up to another level of conflict if Russia...
The danger of not helping Ukraine is greater than the danger of helping them.
All right. Steve?
I completely disagree. I think that the idea of attacking inside Russia with long-range missiles is bound to escalate the war, and the Russians will take seriously dangerous steps. We don't want to encourage that. I think there's no point in it anyway because it has no military value. The bottom line here is that if we keep pushing the Ukrainians, they're just going to have higher casualties, lose more people. This war is going to become more awful, and it's got no good outcome from our point of view or anybody else's point of view, including the Ukrainians themselves. And I know you cited some polls. I don't know about these polls, but I don't care what the polls say. If they want to go and die, they'll go and die. But I think the bottom line here is that this is a very bad war. It's going south very quickly. And I think it would be very important if the U.S. really wanted to pursue a policy, it would try to find some way to open the door to talk to Moscow overall, because we have no relationship at all with the Russians right now. I think that's a mistake. We're not physically at war with Russia. There's still room for diplomacy. And I'm not a diplomat, but I think diplomacy here would be helpful.
Steve, wouldn't you say, according to some American foreign policy mavens, that the interest of the U.S. being served here is the weakening of Russia?
If they are being weakened. I mean, that's an interesting question, which I don't think we know the answer to. I mean, they're strengthening their military. They're adding new conventional and unconventional weapons to their arsenal. They've ginned up their industrial complex to produce more and more weapons. Are we weakening them? Not sure. The sanctions didn't have their impact. They were supposed to knock them out. Didn't work. It backfired to a certain extent. We have certainly divorced Russia from the West. That's been a success, if that was our intention. But that also shuts down an avenue for the future and push the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. Is that good policy? I don't think so. So I think overall, it's not been very brilliant.
I don't know where to start. The Russian economy is weakened, and by their own statistics and projections, it is going downhill. Cooperation with China is serious, along with Iran, but you're not going to separate Russia from China. That's an illusion. There's no way to do that. When you travel along the Russia-China border, the Russian officials get more of their money out of Chinese bribes than they get from their own salary. They have, Russia essentially has become almost a colony of China, and that's not likely to change. So,
well, gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time now, and I would like to thank our two guests, Herman Pirchner, the president of the American Foreign Policy Council, and Dr. Stephen Bryen, who is a senior fellow at the American Center for Democracy within the Center for Security Policy, for joining me for part 2 of the long-running debate we have had on the subject of the Ukraine-Russia war. So I'd like to thank you two gentlemen and thank our audience for joining us today, and also invite you to go to the Westminster Institute website on YouTube to find many of the other programs that we have done over the years, including on this subject with other guests, including on some of the foreign policy questions both our guests have addressed regarding NATO, regarding China, Taiwan, and Japan. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Robert Riley.